My name is Sofia Ehrich, and I'm an art historian, academic researcher, and curator of multisensory experiences. Right now, my main work is with the European-funded project, Odoropa, which advocates for smells and smelling as important to Europe's cultural heritage. And it is my pleasure to welcome you as the host of the Internet of Senses podcast for the Sense of Smell. And today I have Saskia Wilson-Brown with me, who I think for many of us in the smell industry does not need an introduction, but even then, I will let her introduce herself today, actually. So Saskia, can you start off the podcast by introducing yourself?
Yes, I can. My name is Saskia Wilson-Brown, and I am the director and founder of the Institute for Art and Olfaction here in trafficky, congested Los Angeles.
So today we will talk about the Institute for Art and Olfaction, of course, and also about Saskia's PhD research, which focuses on perfume and IPR, or intellectual property rights, which we'll expand on more later as to what that means and why these two things are related, perfume and intellectual property rights. So to kick off the podcast, I know that you previously worked in entertainment and as an art director and producer. And because I have similar interests actually in entertainment and art direction, I wanted to know, did this influence your decision to go into working with scent as a creative medium and to open the Institute for Art and Olfaction?
Not really. I think the thing that influenced me more was my practice as an artist, And, art director sounds fancy, but actually what the job entailed was a lot of driving around and picking up things and wrangling snakes. And, it was a very hard job, let's put it that way. So I think a lot of why I became interested in scent was, a result of working in the entertainment industry, I guess, and finding that it lacked what I needed to be happy. So it was sort of more in opposition to, although there's a lot of parallels between film and perfumery, which I was interested in as well. But I don't think that there's much of a relationship, except maybe the fact that like media and smell is a time-based medium. I don't know. It certainly didn't impact like the starting of the Institute, except in opposition to, I think. Yeah.
So were you an artist before you
Yes.
went into scent? Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I was an artist. I am an artist, or I was an artist. That's what I studied. I got a master's in art, and that's what I was interested in when I got into the film and TV world, because, one needs to make a living. And in the States, and as well as everywhere in the world, really, it's really hard to be an artist. It's a hard slog. So I started doing art department stuff. I mean, to be perfectly honest, most of what I did in that space was production assistance, like an art department PA. And then eventually I got a couple jobs as a production designer, which was for like a couple hip hop videos for Master P. So, the design was literally placing the girls in bikinis and the snakes. But anyway, the whole thing was just to support my art practice. And that's sort of where the Institute stemmed from, was that interest in art.
And so can you explain what the Institute for Art and Olfaction is and how it came to be?
There's like 3 Genesis stories. So I'll give you the comprehensive story. So at the time where I became interested in the perfume industry, I was working at a TV network as a producer. I was in charge of getting content from people for the network and running a team of people that got content for the network. And so I was interacting a lot with filmmakers, and I had run a film festival before that. And a lot of the filmmakers were talking about the fact that the structures in the film industry and the TV industry were exclusionary, designed for, obviously there's a lot of gatekeeping. And thank God YouTube had started. So thank God there was this sort of space for democratization that was starting to impact how the filmmakers and storytellers were able to get their story out. So that's sort of what I was steeped in. I was sort of consulting, and I was on panels and stuff talking about, quote, the democratization of film and TV. And that was, of course, concurrent to my art practice. And so when I discovered the world of fragrance, the sort of industry of fragrance, it was through the good graces of a friend, David, who gave me a book called The Emperor of Scent about Luca Turin, written by Chandler Burr. And I read this book, and it was like a revelation, because all the interest I had in this sort of democratization of media, I felt hadn't been applied to the scent industry, and it hadn't, So that's sort of what was the genesis of the idea of the Institute. And then adding to that, the fact that I was an artist and I was really interested in social practice, sort of the act of intervening in something through art. So it sort of was a perfect storm of interest that led me to start the Institute. But yeah, it was a lot of factors at play, but mostly an interest in accessibility.
And if you could explain what the Institute does in just a few sentences, what would you say?
The Institute is a nonprofit devoted to experimentation and access in the field of perfume. And we accomplish this through several modes of activity: education, advocacy, and experimentation. That's my short.
Perfect.
That's short.
Perfect. So you touched upon this open access aspect of the Institute. So this is probably part of the reason why it's a nonprofit, but I was curious why you made the institution a nonprofit and not something that was for profit.
Well, I mean, that gets a little bit into my personal values. We won't go into politics, but I have, a rational suspicion of our expression of capitalism, our current expression of capitalism, and particularly what I find annoying and distasteful on a personal level and also problematic on a global level is this idea of luxury marketing and luxury products and exclusionary practices. All that stuff just bugs me. It bugs me from just a sheer social justice perspective. So, I mean, the idea of starting yet another for-profit enterprise in perfumery and sort of like delving into that language that's, we've been sort of forced into for the last century, this idea of like, oh, it's only the best and it's very expensive and blah, 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 blah. I found it really, really, really boring, not to say that there's not a place for it, but it wasn't a place that I wanted to be in. So the Institute, the point of the nonprofit was because this is a social intervention. You know what I mean? This wasn't to create more perfume products for the world. It was to create a space where people could engage with scent in a creative capacity, which we have for millennia. Like, you don't have to engage with scent through commerce. There's other ways to engage with this. So it was for artists, basically. And so, the nonprofit format felt more appropriate for that. Plus, I was the co-director of a film festival, which is a nonprofit. And I just sort of I like the ethos of doing things for the community versus personal or institutional gain.
Yeah, and it's really interesting because perfume is like a luxury product.
Yeah. I mean, my mom always says that I'm the only idiot who started a nonprofit in a place where people actually make money. I'm like committed to poverty. But there's a bigger picture at stake, and it's okay. I can hustle.
in a way that makes you super unique and makes the Institute very unique, right?
Yeah, I mean, but uniqueness, the thing about it, Sophia, is like you can be unique, but you also need to survive, you know what I mean? Because otherwise there's no impact. So that was sort of my second thing, was not only am I going to make this a nonprofit, but it's going to succeed. It's going to prove that you can work in this space outside of commerce and succeed and be a sort of thing people can copy. People can emulate the model that we set up. That was sort of the point, was to make sure that it wasn't just sort of sitting in the corner and then disappearing after a year, was to make it successful, and that takes a lot of care, a lot of really keeping an eye on survival, but also fulfilling the mission. So I don't know, that's a bit of a tangent, but.
Yeah, but it highlights an interesting thing that I think you've brought to this field, is that, I mean, a lot of us are very inclined to hold things very closely, right? To like keep it to ourselves. But then this idea that you created an institute that you want to be copied or you want to be shared and opened for more people, that's very special, I think, and well needed.
I mean, it might be abnormal in the field of perfume, but I mean, when I came to the Institute, as I just said, I was working in film. And so there was this whole narrative around information sharing, open source, peer-to-peer sharing, all that stuff that was happening in film. So for me, it was pretty obvious, you know what I mean? I mean, I know that the perfume industry has a tendency to be pretty, let's say, guarded, but since I didn't come from the industry, it didn't even occur to me that would be an option. You know what I mean? Like,
yeah. So the Institute for Art and Olfaction is in Los Angeles, which is super cool for me because I'm a Los Angelino.
Yay.
So why did you start the Institute in Los Angeles? And how does the Institute serve Los Angeles? How is it shaped by Los Angeles? So yeah, why Los Angeles is my question.
Yeah, and there's a couple answers. The first is very pragmatic. I live here, and I'm an adult, so I couldn't, so I was first interested in sort of learning about the practice of fragrance, and I quickly found that really, at the time, really the only place to learn was to sort of try to get into Haas Institute for Perfumery or whatever. And that just didn't seem feasible. And then on top of that, LA presented itself as a viable option, not just because I live here and I like it, but also because it is so unreached by the fragrance industry. It's the edge of the Eurocentric world, And also, LA is a highly diverse and unique sort of mix of cultures that aren't, I don't think, represented in fragrance, or haven't been up until fairly recently. So it just felt obvious, It's a very populist has the wrong implications, but it's a messy city. It's a tangle, and I like that aspect of the sort of chaos of LA and the chaos of the cultures intermingling. Felt like it was a place where unique things could come out for fragrance that wouldn't be like, we're going to launch yet another luxury brand, And I was right. I think LA really did bring that, not to the detriment of other cities, but LA really has a unique sort of openness also to things that I didn't encounter, for instance, when I lived in London or Paris, where things are very like, that's not for you. So I like that about LA.
Yeah, there's kind of a place for everyone, I think.
Yeah, and it's not like, not to idealize the city, it's a mess, There's a place for us in this mess here, because it's a mess. No one's there to say, sorry, you can't do that. I mean, there are, but generally speaking, like you don't feel that sort of pushback all the time. When I lived in London, I mean, I moved to LA from London and I was like a bartender, and I was an artist and I was trying to get into, I wasn't a great artist in fairness, but I kept trying to sort of participate in culture. And I kept feeling I didn't have the right accent. I just wasn't the right person for that space. And I remember I actually came back to LA just for a little break to visit my dad. And I got in from London, and the morning I got back, 5 a.m, because I was jet lagged, I sat at this cafe on Sunset Boulevard. And I just remember feeling like, wow, this is so chill and so easy. And why suffer? Why suffer in this world? Why be in a place where no one wants you? Just go to a place where people don't care. I didn't have the constitution for these sort of exclusionary cultures or my place in these exclusionary cultures. So it felt right.
Is there anything in the Institute or in the maybe foundations of it that you really feel is Los Angeles, like that, or that has been shaped in a way? Yeah. Like you feel, okay, this is really something that would only happen in Los Angeles, or the Institute was really shaped by the city in this way, or I've left a mark in this part of Los Angeles using the Institute, or something like this. Like, I know that you've worked with a lot of museums in the area. So do you think you've added like a olfactory identity to Los Angeles?
I mean, I hope so. I mean, certainly the culture around scent here has grown since I started the Institute. And I don't know if that's because of the Institute or concurrent to, or so I don't know, but I certainly hope there's been an impact to the city. I do think that there's a lot of scent community here and a lot of artists actually working with scent, which is really cool, sort of in their own way, not trying to fit into the sort of museum structures and all that. But I mean, in terms of what is uniquely LA about the Institute, I think the sort of messiness of LA translates to the Institute. The fact that it's, I've resisted corporatizing it as much as I have been able to for these last 12 years, and I've sort of resisted hierarchy structures, and I've resisted sort of kowtowing to the industry. I mean, I obviously have friends within the industry and I respect them exceedingly, but writ large, the industry hasn't done us any favors as far as I'm concerned. So I've been sort of proudly or fiercely independent often, with some exceptions, we do have to survive. But so I think that's pretty LA. And I think that that's something that I couldn't have done in other cities because I think the pressure would have been too high to fit in or to go to these events, these industry events and whatnot. And for good and for bad, because the flip side of that is you start to sometimes one might say that you end up sort of isolating yourself into this little unique space that, has no relevance on the larger world. I mean, that's the stuff I think about at 3 a.m. when I can't sleep. But generally speaking, it's been a happy experience, in a way that I think is nice, that you can be successful at something and you can also be happy and also not be a jerk, like you can be happy and successful and not be a jerk. And that's something I think the Institute has done. And I think that's something that fits in well in LA.
Yeah, and I think that you've well balanced these challenges or these concepts. I think you've well balanced it because the Institute is very well known.
So to make sure that we have the international connection, we've done programs that are intentionally international, and I've intentionally visited and come over, done things there. And that's important to me personally because I was raised internationally.
Okay, so I find that the Institute is really at the crossroads of art, culture, business, and olfactory studies. And you've told me that this is also kind of where your PhD research lies.
Yes.
So, how have these concepts played a role in your career so far, and how do they speak to each other?
Art and culture, and I would say accessibility is another one in there, have been the core of everything I've done since I started my career, as it were, and that stems from my father, who is, in the public arts and who's a super community oriented, open, happy, awesome dude, you know what I mean? And he's also Cuban. So there's a lot of context politically there, So that's art, culture, and accessibility are super important to me. And my entire life, I've been averse to business. I found business to be problematic, at least the way we do business in the US. But with the PhD, the art, culture, accessibility, and business are sort of convening, because what I realized, after running the Institute for 12 years or however many years, is that business is an important part of this because we live in the world we live in. And business is really where the power lies. My dad told me once, I was like, oh, I don't want to get money from that person. He's like, honey, don't kid yourself. Money is power. So if you ignore money, you're ignoring power. And it was something he said kind of offhand, but it really stuck with me that actually, like, if you're studying accessibility and power, you have to follow the money. You have to go to where the money is. And that is, at least in the fragrance industry, also in media, in the big businesses that run it. So that's sort of where that interest started to play in.
Yeah, it's funny because I, like you, was always kind of adverse to business. Like, oh, I don't need a MBA. Yeah. I want to study art or culture, whatever that may be. But my mom always said to me, Sophia, you will need business.
Yeah,
you will
it's
always
the folly
need
of youth. We think we can get by without it, but no.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I mean, then as you progress in life, you learn that being business minded, it doesn't necessarily mean you have to have an MBA, but just having that kind of business mind can really help in any field that you look at. And I think for you, it's very prominent. Also, the fact that you have a nonprofit, or
right,
you have to create programs within the Institute which can serve the community, but you're balancing these ideas of profit and
and then there's the additional thing that within the context of the Institute, like, I have my opinions about business, but that's definitely not what the community, a lot of people in the community feel. So what I've started to realize, actually, with the help of the board of directors, who are all like, grow up, Saskia, they're awesome. But what I've started to realize is, like, if we're actually trying to serve the community, we do need to think about survival mechanisms and helping them figure out how they fit into this industry, as it were. So yeah, I've been paying more attention to it because of that, because that's honestly what the community needs. Like, it's all well and good to be like, oh, you don't need to worry about money. That's a place of privilege to say that. Most people really do need to worry about money. And interestingly, my PhD, it's social practice art, it's business studies, and it's, obviously olfactory studies. So it's interesting to me that suddenly I'm doing a PhD that is related to business very closely.
I really look up to you, Saskia. I think you're an awesome person. Why did you then decide to pursue a PhD?
Well, I mean, we all have our mother's voices in our heads, you know what I mean? Like, and my mom, I think if I'm speaking really honestly, like, it came from a place of feeling like I wasn't doing enough. I wasn't succeeding according to my mother's standards, which are, intellect. She's an intellectual, or a wannabe intellectual, so there's that sort of what is the meaning of all this kind of nonsense that we all get. And then on top of it, I've been running the Institute, just churning through it, just running and constantly just working for nigh on to 12 years. And I just needed to formalize what I've learned. I just needed to sit down, I'm trying to sit down and be like, okay, all this work I've been doing, all this like hustle, what is it? What's the bigger picture of all this? Because I actually, this is a thing. Like, I don't really care about perfumery as an industry. I love it, you know what I mean? But it's not my first passion. My first passion is creative expression writ large. So perfumery for me is just one example among many. Like, here's an industry or a practice that's been industrialized and made exclusionary. And if we can sort of examine those power narratives or structures of exclusion in one industry, you can apply that to any industry. So that's sort of the big picture, is creating a model or creating a map, really, of how to disrupt a space, not to the, destruction of it, but just to create space for other people within it, So that's the big picture of the PhD. And that's, I meandered. I'm sorry, Sophia.
No, that's okay. I want to go back to what you said about why you pursued your PhD, because I think this is a really important thing to mention, that a lot of us think of PhDs as something that we do at maybe even in an earlier stage in our life, where we're like trying to kind of tick a box, like, okay, we're continuing research in a way. But I really like this idea also that you just mentioned, that it's like, okay, I was doing all these things. I was, serving the community. I was shaping an institute, all these very kind of practical things, you could say. And I just needed a point where I looked back and reflected
Yeah,
on what I
yeah,
was doing, why I was doing it,
exactly.
what I learned. And I think that's really important to think of a PhD in that way, or even any sort of research.
Yeah, exactly. And that's, I think, the advantage of coming to it a little bit later, or as they kindly say, mid-career, is that you have been working, and I'm a producer at heart, like when there's a problem, I produce the result, like that's what I do. So to take that moment to be like, let's stop producing, let's stop being productive and just actually think about it, for me was really, I mean, it's really important, and I think I would hope that everybody would have a moment to try something like that, whether it's a PhD or a book or an essay or whatever, just to reflect, and
It's super challenging as well.
oh my God, it's like, it's also, it doesn't come naturally to me. I'm not
Yeah.
someone to do all the research patiently and check my sources. It's just not I don't have that brain. So it's definitely hard.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I might totally screw it up. I mean, it could be that when it's published, people are like, this is nonsense. And that is what it is. It might happen.
So to continue on what you're getting out of your head and into your PhD, can you explain what IPR is and what perfume is, and why do or don't those two things go together?
Okay, so the PhD is about networks of power and accessibility in the fragrance industry. And one of those networks is intellectual property law, writ large, one of many. So how it relates to perfumery is how it relates to any creative practice, in the intellectual property, forms who has access or doesn't have access to certain things. And also it forms how industry is run and controlled. So, I don't know if you want something more specific, but it's like one of the flavors in the soup of accessibility. And, in the film industry, for instance, when I was working at this TV network, there was this whole movement around peer-to-peer distribution. So one example would be people were pirating movies and releasing them in these networks that were uncontrolled. It was piracy networks, you know what I mean? And one friend of mine then, Jamie King, started a company called Vodo, where he was actually trying to figure out how one could, rather than fighting those piracy impulses, one could work with them in order to better the place of the independent filmmakers. So he started this thing, Vodo, where basically it was a peer-to-peer distribution network that was powered by donations. So people could donate, versus buy if they wanted to, or they also couldn't. And it was pretty successful. People made pretty legitimate money, not crazy amounts, but it was new in that space. And to me, that was very inspiring, that there's a way to harness or to rethink intellectual property in a way that both somehow respects the rights of the creator, because that's super important, but also allows the free flow of ideas and information, and most importantly, education. I mean, I'm still working it out, so I don't have the answer in fragrance, like check in 2 years, you know what I mean? But I suspect that there's a way to do it differently than it's done currently.
How is it done currently? Is
I
there
knew you were going to
IPR?
ask that. Well, it's complicated, but there's patent law which protects the process by which people come to a molecule or whatever. There's obviously trademark, which protects brands and brand identities. And then there's copyright, which famously in perfume, you can't copyright a formula. It's one of those cliches people tell you, and it's true. So people are trying to address it. Actually, notably, Christophe Lodemiel and some other folks have been trying to address it through the concept of trade dress. So applying trademark to scent by arguing that scent is part of the brand identity, for instance, like Play-Doh or Crayola crayons or Abercrombie and Fitch or whatever, these companies that are so strongly identified with a smell. So I'm not able to draw any conclusions. I'm just examining what's happening. You know what I mean? So, and then hopefully after a couple of years, I'll have some conclusions to draw, but it's curious. What there isn't really space for yet in fragrance is this idea of sort of copyleft or open source, or although it's changing, or Creative Commons. This interest originally came out of an interest I had in sort of how can we apply Creative Commons to fragrance? Like, can we apply the rules of Creative Commons or adapt them for fragrance creation, for formulas and so on? And some really interesting people in this space are Christophe Ledemiel, a fragrance drama on Instagram, who's a really cool person based in Eastern Europe, has been publishing formulas. There's people interested in this space as well that I'm just sort of keeping an eye on.
Yeah, it's a very interesting but also very challenging area of this.
Yeah, because my initial impulse was, of course, like, information needs to be free, creativity needs to flow. This is more important than your stupid bottom line. You know what I mean? Growing up a little bit, we all have kids and families and more. Like, I understand creatives need to be paid, or they need to survive. Otherwise we don't have art, it's just, and since we don't live in a society where we support creatives with government funding or anything like that, like the only tools they have at their disposal is their intellectual property. So I have a very nuanced view of it now, that I didn't have, say, 10 years ago. But yeah, maybe that will evolve further. I don't know.
I'm sure it will. So you're also working a bit with the history of the industry, of the perfume industry. So how has the history of the perfume industry and the and international production of aromatics shaped the current state of the flavor and fragrance industry?
Well, I mean, that's a big answer. Writ large, the what I'm arguing, at least in my thesis, and I don't think it's a big argument, is that the way the fragrance industry has been created was based on models set up in Europe, and business models. And it was so closely tied historically to the aristocracy in Europe. Historically, like deep history, not necessarily the case, but in the genesis of the fragrance industry. And those sort of associations and structures evolved to become the industry as we know it today through a series of mergers and acquisitions and all that beautiful stuff. And so the big argument that I make, every day what I teach is that this one narrative of what fragrance is not the only narrative of what fragrance is, or could be. Like, it doesn't have to be tied to commerce. It could just as easily have been tied to art making, or meditation. I don't know. And so basically sort of examining that trajectory of how the fragrance industry became will, I hope, help me sort of pick apart where the roots of practice became entrenched to the exclusion of others. And that, of course, impacts accessibility for people like you and me.
Yeah, and that's interesting what you said about all the different parts of scent making. It's not, there can't be just one, because this is such an interdisciplinary place to be. I mean, there's aromatherapy, there's perfumery, of course, but the way that scent is used is in so many different ways.
Absolutely.
Or in religion. So
seduction, health, beauty, you name it, it's all there.
Yeah.
But the way we've been sort of, I don't know, we've been led or trained or encouraged or whatever to use it is in the context of buying a perfume at a department store mostly.
Yeah, I think it kind of goes back to historically, smell has been kind of this sense that we don't talk about that much. So there is still space to prove a lot of things, or there's space for people to make claims which haven't been necessarily proven.
Exactly.
Because we all just kind of work in it without
taking the time to reflect, right? Or research.
Yeah.
And I hold myself in that group. Like, I've definitely made claims like perfumery is Eurocentric, it's a claim I make all smug. I mean, it is, but it also really isn't, historically. So it's sort of expanding the lens a little bit too for myself. There's a lot of things being said on the internet and it's hard to find your place in it. It gets a little dizzying, so that's sort of my attempt with this PhD, is to be like, just no, stop, everybody, Saskia, shut up, everybody, shh. Like, what do I actually know as a person? And then hopefully communicate that adding to the work that's been done by amazing people doing work in the space, like Caro Verbeek and, all these people who are doing all this work already, Nuri McBride, just adding my own little part of it, my own little research, hopefully.
And is there space for more experiential uses of scent in your PhD, or are you really focusing on
it's part of the process is narrowing down your focus. So when I first started the program, I was like, I'm going to write the history of scent, and access for all time in all cultures. And my advisor was like, cute. So part of this narrowing down of my focus has been, I'm talking a little bit about experimental work with scent or olfactory art or stuff like that, but really, I'm really having to narrow it down to the practice of perfumery as a product you put on the skin, because otherwise I could be doing this for 50 years and still not have anything to show, so I'm touching on olfactory art and all that, but I'm not going too deep.
Well, and part of this great future that we're heading towards, I guess, is that there's so much experimentation happening out there. And that's also part of the Institute for Art and Olfaction, that there's so much experimentation happening as well. And this is it's a really cool space.
It's a cool time to be alive, in general, and especially if you're interested in fragrance. What an amazing space we're all in now, where we have access to all this stuff, these ideas and whatnot. It's cool. It's super cool. I think we're fortunate.
So I know you're still early in your research, but maybe you have a little bit to say about what an inclusive network of the perfume industry looks like, or some of the changes that we could make to achieve an inclusive network.
I will say, from experience running the Institute, in terms of sort of creating avenues for inclusion, one, it's sort of a shift in the idea of paucity, of lack, and this gets a little California hippy dippy, but the idea of abundance versus non-abundance. I discovered fragrance, I got very excited about perfume, and suddenly I was like, that's my space, I'm the perfume person, whatever. Like that, I'm not saying I do that, but there are moments, that attitude is a larger problem, I think, in the world and with humans and overpopulation and all that. But that attitude needs to shift, I think, for there to be more inclusive practices. So it's like a psychological thing on the part of individuals in the space. And then tied to that is making space for other people. And I still hear this stuff. It's crazy. People still say, oh, well, the best perfume, of course, is made in glass or whatever. And I'm like, what are you talking about? Not to discount the fact that they do amazing work in glass, but best, that's a big statement. Like, what is best to you? How are you defining best here? You're defining it, if I would guess, along a certain narrative of history, which is, sorry to say, Eurocentric, exclusionary, pretty short-sighted, if you look at it from a global perspective. So those kind of statements, or even the statements like, I'm the first to do blank. Like, no, you're probably not, like this idea that me, I need to own this. It comes from fear. It comes from anxiety. It comes from the fact that we all feel like there's not enough for us. And that's something that I think the industry hasn't discouraged, because it creates also the idea of value. So when you do have access to these things, suddenly they're worth a lot more to you, because you feel like you can't have access to them otherwise. And people can take advantage of that.
Yeah, that's not necessarily focused on the scent realm that we're in. I think this is just in general to
a bigger
be
picture problem.
Yeah, be a more inclusive person, and welcome people into
and it's look, it's really hard, like when I'm feeling insecure, or I haven't slept enough, or I feel like I got ignored in a context of something where like, I did that, why didn't they see me? Like that happens to me all the time, where I'm like, what about me? When you're in that space, like it's really easy to start being like, well, me, not you. And then you pass that along, and so, it's work that I do all the time, despite my worst instincts, just be like, no, it's cool. There's room for everyone. It's like a mantra. There's room for everyone. There's room for everyone. It's all good. We can all do this. We can all coexist. Like there can be independent and mainstream fragrance. There could be, experimental and, scientific work. And so this can all coexist. But it's devilishly hard. It's human instinct to protect yourself. And so you throw intellectual property in there and it gets really messy, as you can imagine.
Yeah. And I think your podcast, Perfume on the Radio, is a perfect example of including so many people. Every time I listen to that podcast, I think, wow, there's so many amazing people out there in this industry doing super awesome things.
Yeah, there are. It's crazy. Never ending,
Yeah.
like a parade of incredible people, It's
Yeah.
pretty
And
awesome.
yeah, I applaud you on that podcast, because
Oh,
I think
thanks, dude.
it's really fun to hear all the different things that people are doing, and in so many different ways, so experimental. But then you also see that you've kind of created a platform for people to have these conversations. And I think that's exactly what you're saying is needed. So we just need to continue that, I guess, in more places.
Yeah, yeah. It's hard.
So where do you see the future of this field going in terms of open access and IPR? And what
I
would you
mean,
want to see happen?
I think that, listen, like film and TV, like music, like, you name it, like get with the program, it's happening. You know what I mean? Sharing, open source, formula sharing, yada, yada, it's happening. So I think that if, the mainstream industry were to, and I understand it's complicated, but in an ideal world, acknowledging the fact that this is happening and sort of shifting the idea of secrecy and getting more to an idea of excellence and quality would be amazing. Like, you don't corner the market because you're the only one with the information, but you corner the market because you're producing really beautiful things, or making space for really beautiful things would be an incredible place for the industry to go. Christophe Lodemiel speaks more eloquently and more passionately about this than I do. So I would refer people to check out what he says about it. Personally, I'm not so interested in product, you know what I mean? So, or industry writ large. I don't really care what the industry produces. I don't buy it. I barely pay attention to it. So I don't really care what happens with the industry, but what I do care about is what happens with creativity and accessibility. So in my world, in the Saskia planet, what would happen is it would be more and more artists working with scent, and also doing the research, being aware of what they're doing and building on each other versus constantly presenting the same idea as an original idea, which is happening a lot. People like the first to invent the idea of broadcasting earth into a gallery. I mean, come on, guys. And that requires, information sharing. It requires more researchers, more people studying, more people publishing about olfactory art and experimental work with scent. And it requires people being open to the fact that they didn't invent this. You can't say that anymore. If anything, Peter de Cooper has done it at least once. If not him, Sissel Tolas has done it. People have done, Maki Ueda, there's people who have done the work, the creative work, and it's time to build on the existing work. And that requires information sharing and information in general.
So do you want to take a few minutes to say what's happening right now at the Institute for Art and Olfaction, or what tasks you've set the team to?
Sure. The team has set me to some tasks, which is professionalize the Institute. So the big thing, it's called founders syndrome. It's something that when you start a nonprofit and you run it for so long, this phenomena happens where it's that ownership and sort of fear thing. And I'm fighting it in myself, where it's mine. No one can touch it, and it stops evolving. It ends up sort of just sitting and eventually dying. So the team and I together have been working quite intensely on creating structures so that the Institute can survive past me. There's that. More fun, things that we're working on is we've been working on this amazing library of perfume books and materials. And we have our organ and all that, but this library of books that we're trying to sort of cobble together and turn into a larger program, a larger sort of open access digital library that can connect to other libraries and collections. And that's been something that we've been working on a lot with Daniel Krasovsky and Charles Rosenberg and a couple other folks at the Institute. And I'm excited about that. We have this gallery space that, is sort of inspired by and working alongside it in partnership with Olfactory Art Keller, sort of trying to have that bi-coastal space for olfactory art, which I've been really enjoying curating. What else is going on? We're launching the 10th awards in about 2-3 weeks here in December, which are going to be in Lisbon this year for a 10th year.
What are the awards, just for context, in case you don't know?
Yeah. Sorry. The Art and Olfaction Awards are an annual, except for COVID, mechanism designed to celebrate independent artisan and experimental practices with scent. Yeah. Nuri McBride and I are working on a journal called Alabastron, which is coming out sometime in 2024. It's a journal, so it's sort of, academic-ish, but we're trying to, it's academic, Nori's an academic, but we're trying to also make it super accessible. So it's a mix of academic writing and embodied narratives and more accessible writing about scent culture as a whole. And that's been a lot of fun to work with Nori and co-edit this thing. And there's other stuff, I just can't think of it right now. There's a lot going on.
Did you mention all the classes that you?
Oh yeah. We're also doing classes.
Which is an important one because our viewers and listeners can join.
Yes, they can. They can. And in fact, what we're working on right now, by we, I mean a group of people at the Institute, Ashley Eden Kessler, Lakenda Wallace, Donna El Masri, and a few other folks are working on formalizing our education a little bit into a more certificate program, basically, so that people can take one-offs, and the sort of loose caboose approach we have is going to stay, but there's also going to be an option to do it more formally, and that should be coming around in 2024-ish, or 2025 possibly.
Yeah. Wow, fantastic.
Yeah, it's a big one, and they're doing really good work on that, you know. Oh, and Julianne Lee too is in that crew.
Wow, that's really cool.
Yeah,
I'm looking forward to hearing more about that.
Yeah, me too. They're working on it right now.